Most of us who've taken psychedelics will have had the experience of feeling connected to nature in a way that it's almost like our eyes have been opened as to what nature is and how we are related to it. And it's this phenomenon that I'm discussing in this conversation with Dr. Sam Gandy, who, as well as being very interested in psychedelics, is an ecologist whose area of expertise is this intersection between nature and consciousness, why it's so important, and how our disconnection from it might be impacting our species and contributing to the current mental health crisis. Now, I actually got to see Sam present this topic at a psychedelic conference that I recently attended here in Switzerland, and he was one of my favourite speakers from that event. So I'm really excited to bring Sam on the show and have this conversation and share it with you guys. And as you'll see, he's a really awesome guy. I had a lot of fun talking to him. So without further ado, I bring you Sam Gandy.
Well, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then maybe I'll pick up from there and explain a little bit about how we came to be talking here. So who is Sam Gandy?
Thanks for having me, Rob.
My pleasure, mate.
So me, Sam Gandy. I guess one of the things I should say to kind of set things in motion is that I'm a nature-loving guy. Always have been. Like, even before I was conscious of the fact there's photo evidence of me crawling around, poking around in the garden, and that's sort of always been there. That curiosity and sense of wonder and appreciation for nature, for wildlife, for the outdoors. And I guess as I got older, I kind of funneled that into academia a bit. I did a master's in entomology and study of insects, and then I kind of did a PhD that combined entomology and ecology. And but it was actually during my undergraduate degree that I was in London at the time. I was based at Imperial in London, and it just so happened at the time that it was that narrow, interesting window of time when psilocybin mushrooms were legal. You could walk into Camden at the High Street in London and buy fresh mushrooms.
Did I miss something?
Yeah. There were heady days. It didn't last long. There was a loophole in the law that saw them as a foodstuff if they were fresh. Whereas if you prepared them or dried them or did anything with them, they became a Class A drug. So unsurprisingly, that loophole was closed, but people did make hay while the sun shone there. And so that was my first encounter with psychedelics, with psilocybin, with legally purchased high street mushrooms, and I was sort of a bit curious. I had a really good friend who sort of was there with me, and we bought some of these fresh mushrooms and we munched the box down, not really fully knowing what we were in for, and got on the tube and the underground and went to this electronic nightclub, Fabric, and It was a train wreck of an evening, I would say, in terms of but it was a good learning experience. You really, the whole set and setting thing really kind of sort of came into focus in a big way, and so I did learn from that experience. I kind of, even though it was pretty harrowing, sort of as experiences go, it didn't scare me off or anything. I still knew I'd encountered something powerful and mysterious and interesting, thought-provoking, and I wanted to meet it again, but approaching it with more humility and respect, obviously paying attention to set and setting, and and that sort of, and was rewarded, I feel, for doing so. And that kind of, I've got the type of mind or brain that gets really, when I'm interested in something, I'm really interested in something, I get really engrossed. And once I'd had these experiences, I wanted to know more about this, the wider context of psychedelics, in terms of like indigenous usage of these things, the history attached to them, what happened in the 1960s, how can they be used potentially to sort of like heal people, to treat mental afflictions, what's going on in the brain, all this stuff. So I started writing a few articles, writing a few scientific papers, attending a few conferences like Breaking Convention and speaking there, meeting some of the wider psychedelic kind of community in the UK and beyond. And then eventually I got a job as a scientific director to the head of the Beckley Foundation, which funds and instigates psychedelic research in the UK and elsewhere. And almost at the same time, actually, Robin Carhart-Harris, who did head the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial, I'd met him, and he kind of knew of my love of nature and interest in that, and he invited me to come on board as a collaborator to work on some research looking at how psychedelics affect people's connection to or relationship with nature. And that was I guess my on-ramp into working with psychedelics. I should say as well, honourable credit to David Luke, who you may know, because David helped organise Breaking Convention, and he gave this. I was part of this symposium, and he gave this talk on how psychedelics can affect people's connection to nature and potentially evoke ecological awareness and things like this. And I wasn't aware of anyone working on this kind of stuff, and that's because no one was really at the time, apart from David. But that obviously it bridged two interests, like the whole nature ecology side of things and psychedelia. It's like they meet in the middle here. I wanna join the party at this intersection. That's kind of it in a nutshell, I guess.
Well, I mean, there's a lot there. A lot of threads that I just want to pull there. I think the first one that jumps out to me is what a perfect kind of introduction to psychedelics in the way that I think it really leans into what we're going to be talking about, this kind of relationship with nature, because I think nothing highlights that better than having one of these experiences, like you say, a harrowing experience in the most kind of like artificial of without being on a soapbox, the most wrong of circumstances. And then it kind of really then shines a light on why these things can feel right. And this really leads into why me and you are having this conversation now, because just for the benefit of the audience, you were speaking at a conference that I attended recently called the ALPS conference. And let me see if I don't butcher this acronym. Awareness Lectures in Psychedelic. It's either Science or Studies. I can never remember what the S is.
I think it's Science. Yeah, nice.
Science. Yeah. I think actually they might have swapped it at some point, so I might be right on both points. But either way, this was a very sort of academic, sort of research-driven conference, and a lot of it was kind of focusing on clinical research within sort of like I don't know if lab environments is the right thing, but sort of clinical environment, like very controlled. I think
quite clinical, and some might say dry.
Some might say that, Sam. I certainly would. We can certainly get into that. And then you came in and you gave this speech, and I've got to say, Sam, without blowing smoke up your ass, it was actually my favourite talk of the entire thing.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, just because I think for one thing, it was just coming from such a different angle, and you presented it so well. So yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I'll let you get more into that. Sort of, we'll go into sort of more later on. But I think if I was to sort of put like my understanding of what you were saying around that, it was really about this intersection between psychedelics and ecology, and I think there's kind of like an elephant in the room that I want to tackle, because I think as soon as people start saying that, then like, oh my god, bloody tree huggers, they've got to start going on about feeling one with nature. But it's I mean we've I think most people have had that experience, and we would sort of say that we could easily say it's a desirable experience, or it's a meaningful experience, and then it just collides with the controlled clinical lab experience or whatever, and it really got me thinking about there was a lot there I want to talk about. But just before we get into all that, do you mind if I mean, first of all, I'll say that there is something that we have in common there, because my first experience with psychedelics was similarly horrific, and similarly instantly taught me a lesson about how not to do these things. So I mean, just do you want to go into it? Like, what happened during your horrific experience at Fabric?
Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, it started going a bit weird. Even before we got on the tube, I remember my friend saying, like,
I mean, even getting on the tube has got to be an experience on.
Yeah, no, it kind of was. I mean, again, you know, we were going into it blind. We obviously hadn't like really read up on it or prepared in any way. But even like before we got on the tube, before we left our halls where we were like living, and my friend said, like, I can't feel the top of my head. It just feels open. I was like, I'm not sure that sounds actually that cool, but anyway, let's go with it. And then we'd gone on the tube, and then I had this weird thing. Is it called autiscopy? Is that its name? It's spelled autoscopy. I don't think it's spelled like that, but it's like this. And I've only had it that one time, and I've heard it. I kind of looked it up because I was like, "What the hell is going on here?" And basically, and I've not had it since that first time, but there was a mirror image doppelganger of me sitting next to me on the chair, and I knew it was just a kind of an illusion, but it was very convincing illusion.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of like in awe of this, and was sort of like moving my arms around, and I was kind of like a bit actually oblivious. It wasn't like I was getting paranoid of other people looking at us. I was just kind of like fully in my process and wasn't really thinking about that. But I get the sense that the carriage kind of did empty over the course of our journey, a little bit, and then we got to the club, and then my friend, who was my co-pilot in this, he had a kind of a tripping first as well that he's never had since. And when he was walking through the slightly disorientating, dark and flashing lights, loads of people absolutely rammed. The music wasn't particularly kind of vibing either at that night. And he was fully convinced. He had a full-on dissociative thing where he thought he really was convinced he was walking the streets of Camden when he was walking, like strolling through the nightclub. Then we met someone from our school who was in the year above us at school, and they was like, "Oh God, like I wasn't even like social dynamics. How do you navigate that?" And it was like that was weirder than it ordinarily would have been or needed to be. So yeah, I can't really remember like that much beyond those little weird blips, but it wasn't definitely not a Dear Diary jackpot night kind of thing.
It's kind of, I think it's sort of something worth kind of talking about here then, is because what you've just described, it almost sounds like then the antidote to that would be, let's have a closed, isolated room whereby you are completely in control of your surroundings, and we can play some whale music and you can put a blindfold on. But that's not where you go with it. And I'm completely I think we're on the same page here. So how do you get from the harrowing experience in Fabric? We're not sponsored by Fabric about this.
No, I'm not like slinging.
It's a very nice club, but
I've not made it back. It did, but like, no, I'm not slinging any shit at Fabric.
So how do we get from there? And then what seems to would be the obvious, okay, well, let's neuter all these things that would be kind of bad about it. But then I think where you end up is actually, let's put it into a more natural surrounding where a lot of stuff could happen. So I don't know, could you walk us through like that process there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess basically my view, Robert, on like, how to use psychedelics well. Like, I certainly think there's wrong ways of using psychedelics and dangerous, reckless ways where the chances of adverse reactions and stuff, traumatic experiences goes up. But I don't believe that there's one single right way of using them either. I think it very much depends on, the hoped for outcomes. If you're using psychedelics for therapy, if you're using them in like a group context or a more shamanic context, if you're using them as creativity enhancing agents or using them to connect with nature, each of those approaches is going to call for a very different context to sort of maximize the outcomes. So I'm all for a plurality of approaches when it comes to using psychedelics. There'll be certain situations where the clinical way of doing it is the more appropriate way because it is safe and contained and controlled, and it's also been scientifically tested as well, and we've got good data to show that it works. But I think in other instances, particularly when you're using psychedelics not clinically but for the betterment of well people, there are other sort of situations and settings that might sort of yield other positive outcomes. So yeah, and I guess I don't know, and I'm certainly not having a crack at the clinical model. Like it's definitely it's definitely got its place, but I guess my interest was with the clinical setting. Obviously, the setting is kind of built from the ground up, in the sense that its main function is a container, is a security container. It's comfortable and it's designed, essentially, everything is like pushing you inwards. And that's where, for a few reasons, I mean, like, that's where your kind of psychological spring cleaning is going to happen, is kind of going into your mind. States of inner absorption as well are more likely to predict mystical experiences, spiritual experiences as well, going inwards. And bear in mind, you're lying prone on a sofa or a bed. You're wearing eye shades. You're wearing a headphones with a carefully selected playlist, and you've been primed before to sort of like trust, surrender, let go into your mind, shine a light in the darkest corners of your mind, confront any shadows or monsters that might be residing there, and ask what you're doing in my mind. And if you feel like you're melting, exploding, dissolving, just let it happen, basically. So people have been primed to sort of like go inwards, and that's definitely got its place, I think, particularly as mentioned in a kind of like clinical treatment context. But the external setting there doesn't play much of a role beyond being a kind of security container. Whereas potentially, if you were taking psychedelics in a more nature-based setting, then the setting can become much more of a fundamental part of that experience. And there's plus points for that and maybe minus points for that, because if you're kind of like dazzled with like the wonder and awe and beauty of what you're seeing in a natural environment, you're probably going to be less introspective. You're going to be going inwards probably less, but just because there's more going on in your immediate environment that's kind of drawing your attention out. But obviously that's sort of like, that brings its own benefits as well, potentially, like experiences of connection, of awe, and so it's kind of like it's important to acknowledge it's sort of like a mixed bag of goodies, and maybe things that might be missing from each approach. So I'm certainly not trying to kind of like tarnish or put down other ways of using psychedelics, but I do feel like there's a strong case to be made for using them in a more nature-based, earthy context than they currently are.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd absolutely mirror just what you said there, Sam. I just want to make it completely clear. Yeah, I've got a lot of respect for all the kind of the research and stuff that's happening. I thought the ALPS conference that we were at was really well organised, and I really enjoyed all the talks. So, but I mean, these people are specialists in what they are doing, so it's unsurprising that they can be sort of a little bit tunnel vision on the kind of the specifics of the research, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. Yeah. But I think one of the kind of the concerns that came up, like wider concerns, not concerns with the individuals, but wider concerns as I was musing on this stuff, was, is this how we bring in something as kind of amazing and transformative as psychedelics? Is this how it comes into our society and our culture? As first of all, as a kind of as something which seems to be targeted at sick people, like you are sick, here is a cure, which again it absolutely is. But again, is that the kind of when we talk about psychedelic culture, psychedelic renaissance, we're not necessarily talking about we're talking about integrating them into, for want of a better term, everyday life. So there was something there, like, okay, but I get that there has to be an inroad, so I completely understand that there has to be a way in, and I kind of respect that. But one of the points which I think you raised in your talk, which again was just a light bulb just went on in my mind, was that I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say that when we do psychedelics, we are kind of open. We become emotionally, psychologically just open in every way, and we start kind of absorbing just that whole experience kind of, you know, into ourselves, and this part of the reason why it becomes so transformative. So what are we teaching ourselves culturally if that is the kind of the surroundings with which we open ourselves up to these things? If what we're saying is that this experience needs to happen in such a controlled way, in a concrete sort of fortress, you know, with every single aspect being controlled completely, and, you know, stripped of all sort of outer novelty, and also but completely stripped from the connection to nature. So what are we connecting to other than concrete and sort of, and there's something I think that was kind of like I don't want to sort of make it sound like I'm down, you know, being too critical of this, but it's like, what is that? What is that downloading into us, into our psyche? So I don't know. Maybe if we could just talk a bit about your presentation at ALPS. Like, is it too much to ask for you to put it into like a sort of a nutshell for what would you say?
Well,
the sort of
yeah, I mean, there's a few things to kind of like, to just maybe touch on that you've brought up there. And I see what you're saying, that there's definitely like a bit of a rigidity and an inflexibility and a kind of narrow approach that the clinical model is currently going for. And it's like, so obviously I think I kind of see two things happening side by side at the moment in different parts of the world. And that's the kind of, I guess, the medical therapeutic integration and recognition of psychedelics. So they're going to become, they're going to become part of the medicine bag, if you will, for treating otherwise hopefully intractable mental health conditions. But then also there's the decriminalization movement as well, and which is now, beginning to really pick up pace in the US, like the source of the war on drugs, like, the drugs
crazy, isn't it?
It's like how rapid change is happening there. Now with Oregon and now Colorado, it's at the state level. They're decriminalizing organic psychedelics. So, and I think the decriminalization, I'm kind of like in favor of that, because I think just kind of letting people get on with it. I think when you legalize and regulate, that can create its own sort of issues. But I feel like in those areas, in those states, there'll be more possibility to kind of develop different ways of using these things. So Bob Jesse, who was the guy with Professor Roland Griffiths, who kind of helped ignite the modern research revival. Those two guys were like, they played a big role in sort of like rekindling the flame that had gone out sort of like 3 decades previously. And Bob Jesse, he existed outside of academia. I think he's a computer guy, some computer engineer or something. And his interest in psychedelics wasn't anything to do with their medical potential, but rather their spiritual potential. And he was very interested in particularly in their capacity to lead to the betterment of well people. So that was his personal sort of angle, and he was really passionate about that. And then he kind of ended up meeting Roland Griffiths, who was interested but also disgruntled with his other work, and was like their chats then led to the psilocybin work being done, still being done. So that was a bit of a tangent. I want to just pick up on something and in terms of you being opening up and and kind of vulnerable and like sensitive and sort of raw in some sense as well, like, so you have to pay careful attention to sort of like the context around these experiences. But something that I think is really fascinating from the work that has been done and is being done now is that, at least when it comes to something like psilocybin, evoking changes in people's relationship to nature or connectedness to nature, it doesn't matter that people are being administered psilocybin in otherwise cozy, to be fair, but concrete boxes. It doesn't even, people are being given synthetic psilocybin, not from obviously the fungus, lab-made psilocybin. Not that I really think that makes any difference, but that's just putting it out there. They're being given synthetic psilocybin in a kind of cozy concrete sort of clinical box environment, but it doesn't seem to matter. As in, even when you're giving people that psilocybin, obviously when you're giving it to them, there's not any pre-flight plan where you're like, oh, this is going to affect or influence your relationship with nature. Like that's not on the pre-flight agenda, at all. So it's being kind of given blindly, if you can view it like that. Like, it's not being primed in any way, and obviously, bar other humans, there's not really any nature to speak of. And like, we can get all philosophical and go, well, everything's nature. And it's like, yeah, I get that argument, but I mean like, yeah, life, living,
lush green things, yeah.
Yeah. So that to me is really interesting, because I've kind of scoured the scientific literature on other nature connectedness enhancing interventions. A review paper was published just a few months ago, and these are things like residential stays in national parks, nature-based educational and engagement programs, things like this, and and they can produce like relatively sustained shifts in nature connectedness. Variable in their effectiveness, and they do take time and resources, and the more time and resources they take, the kind of longer the boost in nature connectedness you get. But what was kind of like, I thought, quite interesting from this review paper, having looked at all the studies myself, so I was like, okay, good, I'm on the right lines. Nobody's like assessed these interventions in terms of lasting effects beyond 3 months. Like 3 months is the upper limit. Now I'm a relative newcomer to this field through the kind of psychedelic on-ramp, but my thinking was like, kind of what's the point? I mean 3 months or less is small frickin' potatoes across a human lifespan. Yeah. Can we not do a bit better? Can we not be a bit more ambitious than that? And the fact that psilocybin can elicit these changes in people's relationship to nature when it's given in a context that's kind of like outside of nature is really quite special and unusual, because all those nature connectedness interventions I just mentioned, unsurprisingly, nature is very much the key focus, as you kind of would expect. But psilocybin doesn't even need that. And it seems that even a single experience can potentially elicit changes, and from some preliminary work, it seems like the changes persist as well. They don't sort of fade within that 3 month time window. So that makes me think, well, that's really interesting. But what happens if we actually used something like psilocybin as an applied nature connection in enhancing agent? So it's kind of part of a nature-based approach, setting context with nature-based stuff, kind of themes and content involved. And so it seems like there's great untapped potential yet to be kind of explored there, I think.
Yeah, I mean that's valid. It wouldn't have occurred to me that someone could have that feeling of sort of nature connectedness. Yeah. Like say completely, it kind of I'm picturing some kind of dystopian thing where we just pack human beings into concrete sort of concrete coffin-sized boxes and just give them a drip feed of psilocybin and there we go.
That nature disconnected. Yeah, like
we ticked all the boxes.
Boost me up with some nature stat. No, I do see what you're saying there. I had another little thought bubbling up, but I think it might.
Well, is there anything to compare that kind of experiences against something which is kind of like going all in with the nature experience? So let's say like a very typical South American ayahuasca ceremony where you're kind of like in the jungle, completely surrounded by nature, there's crickets and fireflies and all that stuff. Yeah. Is there any sort of difference in nature connected on the? Is it like a scale of nature connectedness, by the way?
There is. So it's funny that you mentioned that. So I can't actually comment yet, but I'm actually involved in a collaborative study looking at the effects of ayahuasca administered in a Shipibo indigenous-led retreat context in the Peruvian Amazon, and seeing its effect on nature-relatedness. And yeah, that paper is in its kind of latter stages of like crunching the numbers and stuff, and it's basically written, so we'll hopefully be submitting that in the next month or two. And that's been interesting. Like, I guess I can say a few little bits. I mean, it's
come on,
sort of
Sam,
not the
come
dumb
on.
thing your science is published. But what was interesting, at least from our initial kind of delving into the data, was that the number of ayahuasca experiences people had while on retreat wasn't particularly important, which kind of surprised me a bit. I thought there would be some kind of cumulative kind of effect, but it wasn't. It was that was less important. What seemed to be more important was the total length of time people were based at the retreat. And as you said, you've got all those things like fireflies and like all that biodiversity, all that nature, like really in your face nature everywhere. And then even the shamanic context as well is quite nature inspired, you know, down to things like the shakapa, like the leaf rattle, like little elements like that, obviously, sort of are woven into the context. So, yeah, I feel like, yeah, there are ways of supplementing the kind of nature connectedness element. Like, yeah, one guy wrote a paper, he got in touch with me, and he was trying to make the case that, you know, ayahuasca use both in the Amazon but also neo-shamanic contexts in Europe and Australia as well. That there are quite a lot of elements of nature in that sort of shamanic, neo-shamanic context, and that's probably feeding into people's changes in their relationships with nature after the experience. So yeah, essentially at this time we don't have a good grasp on like the overall contribution of these elements. And in fact, in the study that I was involved in, we'd need to do a bigger, more robust, more controlled study to basically disentangle what's the ayahuasca, what's the shamanic context, and what's the context of being in the Amazon rainforest. Like, you know, it's sort of like, yeah, we'd need to kind of like, we are planning a follow-up study, but we'd need to do a bigger, more comprehensive study, I think, to start picking apart what's contributing what exactly.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of factors there. I hope you don't mind asking. Is that an experience that you've had yourself? That kind of traditional Shipibo sort of in the jungle experience?
Yeah, I have. I am experienced actually. I've been to Peru a few times. I did my undergrad there. My sister was based out there. She did shamanic training actually. So I've been out a few times, and yeah, experienced ayahuasca in a traditional shamanic context.
Yeah, I mean, I've been out a few times myself, and it's something I'm a big. I don't know if it's the right word, but I'd say a big fan of. I used to think I would be extremely skeptical of those kind of experiences. All this natural bollocks, but no, I found it incredibly helpful to me, and I think that collision, particularly from somebody who's from like my lifestyle of living, you know, in towns and cities, and you know, growing up in the north of England, and then sort of being placed in this completely nature integrated environment with all the kind of shamanic stuff, as you say. It just, something about it just seems very kind of wholesome, and you know, it really gels well with the whole experience. And I mean, to me, I think there's more to it than just it's just a kind of like doing psychedelics in a kind of a nice environment, in like a pleasant environment. It seems to mesh so well, and even mesh it in kind of very unusual ways. And I'll just to, you know, share sort of like some of the experiences like from my recent retreats. You know, you've got like, it's, you know, what I noticed on my last retreat, there was a big blending of the shamanic kind of experience with the kind of like the UFO experience. So it seems to be a lot of people talking about like, you know, aliens appearing in the jungle. It's just like, well, that's just what happens. It's just, you know, and so yeah, I mean, you get this. I think I was also interested in what you said there about it's not. And let me just make sure I'm understanding this right. It's not the number of ayahuasca ceremonies that you do; it's the amount of time that you spend there. So whether you did sort of 20 ceremonies over a month period or 4 over a month period, the same amount of nature connectedness would occur. Is my understanding right?
Yeah. Take that with a pinch of salt. I mean, this is just kind of preliminary findings, and we're in the process of re-crunching the numbers actually, because we needed a larger sample size of data, which we've got now. Mm-hmm. So we're kind of amending and like refining the paper, but. In the first round of it, that's something that we did find, that the overall length of time people stayed at the retreat was definitely more of an important predictor of nature relatedness increases than the total number of ayahuasca sessions that people had. And what else was quite interesting is that essentially people who are game for doing psychedelics, I've noticed this in a few studies, like one I did with Imperial as well. Such people tend to already rate suspiciously highly in nature relatedness. Like their baseline, like nature relatedness levels are suspiciously high, I would say. And it's kind of like, I mean, we've known it from other survey samples. So one of the things that psychedelics have been sort of linked to is trait openness to experience, like one of the 5 major personality traits, openness to experience. And there's been research showing that if people have a big mystical spiritual experience, it can shift their trait openness to experience will increase. But we also know, going sort of like inverse the other way, rating higher in openness, you're more likely to have a mystical experience to begin with. And it seems that, people who are open and up for doing psychedelics in the first place probably rate higher in openness because of that, because you're even like open to the experience of that. And it seems openness is also strongly correlated with nature relatedness or nature connectedness as well. So there's like there's a certain like self-selection bias of personality traits, and it seems that like I don't think it's as simple and clear cut as like you take psychedelics and it makes you more kind of connected to nature. I think it's like which potentially can do, but I think there's a two-way relationship, I think, on some level, where it seems that more nature connected people are more open to or interested in the experience in the first place, perhaps.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Just coming back to like a point you mentioned earlier about it kind of being like a spiritual experience and how that sort of tied in with what you're saying about psilocybin. I'm a bit of a out there question, but I may as well roll with it. I mean, what's your thoughts on this kind of concept around like spirituality? Because I'll just kind of throw out the dots I was connecting in my mind as you were talking, so that if there is some kind of like spiritual experience, and if that's kind of connecting you to these, not necessarily to grass and to trees, but to this feeling of what we could call nature, or sort of like the Gaia or the universal spirits or whatever, then perhaps it doesn't necessarily matter whether you're in the concrete box or whether you're in the, because you're connecting to some higher thing. And that certainly ties in with, in some way to a lot of the kind of the shamanic concepts around this idea of, spirits and stuff like that. So I'm just wondering, just purely on like a personal basis, like what's your thoughts on this? Like, do you think there is some kind of, is there a spiritual experience? Is there something kind of like greater than us in this kind of nature, or are we just talking about sort of brain states here?
Well, I mean, that's kind of, I guess, a big question. I mean, I will say, because I guess like spirituality, like the word God, or like there's a few other terms that have a lot of baggage and mean very different things to different people. My personal view of take on spirituality is it doesn't need to be subscribing to anything supernatural or anything like that. Personally, for me, like I feel that you can be a grounded atheistic person and still be spiritual. I don't think it's anything to do with necessarily a belief in a higher power or religiosity in any way. To me, spirituality is about connecting to something bigger, something greater than the self, and that can obviously be a perceived transpersonal spiritual essence or like higher power God, but it could also just be like nature and the universe. And And I think, and the thing I kind of like about that is it's kind of like a grounded, tangible form of spirituality as well. It's not, you're not away with the fairies somewhere else. It's like here now, earthy and grounded and like, you know, and visceral and important. You know, it's literally like we come from the earth and we go back to the earth, and like we're on this crazy planet right now at this time, like with this like level of sentience, consciousness, and like it's just absolutely nuts. I mean, like, you know, just that, like the mystery itself. You don't need to potentially, I don't think, subscribe to anything more beyond just than what's happening right now. It's bonkers. So yeah, so you know, but I don't want to like. I feel like, yeah, that's what's quite interesting to me about nature connectedness actually, is because, you know, part of it is kind of keying into one's awareness of being part of a larger interconnected web of life. And like, I guess for some people that might sound a bit hippyish and new agey, but it's really not. I mean, that is a basic bedrock tenet of the science of ecology, you know, which is all about the interconnection of living systems. You know, of course we are part of one interconnected system. It can't exist any other way. That is the fundamental sort of like truth of kind of what's going on. And then, you know, like we've evolved these egos, you know, over the course of evolution, and they, you know, they're concocted by the brain, and they make us feel separate and individual. And you know, there's good reasons for that. I mean, that's, you know, so we kind of like will survive and we'll pass on our genes, and you know, like, and it allows us lots of great opportunities and perspectives that come with that. But yeah, it's good to be reminded that, you know, however tangible that feeling of separation and individuality is, I think the closer, more objective truth is that, you know, we are just, you know, we're, you know, each of us are a single being that's like wedded in an interconnected mesh of other beings. And like, yeah, and I think as well, just extrapolating from that, like we're living in a very disconnected time psychologically, not just from nature. I feel like our society, our civilization, the ideals of our civilization, you know, could be considered to be, well, are like pretty individualistic, pretty materialistic, competitive in some sense. And it's like those things are like what they could be considered to be inversely related to connectedness or connection. And I'm speaking now more widely than nature. I mean connectedness to self, connectedness to others, and connectedness to nature, the world, the universe. And, you know, so, and I feel like I don't want to like oversimplify and generalize too much, but I really do feel that like deep disconnection lies at the root of the mental health crisis we're going through, also the environmental crisis we're going through, and it's unfortunately woven into the very fabric of our societal ideals. And yeah, so that's a major bummer, you know, for all the definite good. And, you know, I'm not like, you know, I'm not saying tear down the, you know, society and like anarchy on the streets right now. Like, you know, I'm grateful for all the various, you know, we're all living longer, we have more opportunities, we have material comforts, you know, access to medicines, all this stuff, and it's fantastic. And, you know, we're having this conversation now through this technology. It's great, but it's like, yeah, it seems that our kind of, I guess, existential psychological needs from our initial kind of, you know, how we used to exist as hunter-gatherer community. You know, we've still got the brains of our Paleolithic ancestors from 200,000 years ago. Only we're like in this like we're kind of, what was it? There's a great quote from the late E.O. Wilson, who's this evolutionary biologist, something along the lines of like, we have the brains of our Paleolithic ancestors, we have medieval institutions, and godlike
technology. Yeah,
and it's like, oh god, it's like the trinity of those things is like, it's a volatile old cocktail.
Oh yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with what you said regarding sort of like you know, spirituality, or define it. For me, it's always felt like it's really an internal, like a sense of alignment. It's and so you can kind of feel when you are off, you know, when you are sort of acting toxic and being a shit, and just you can feel that way, and you can also feel when you're aligned, and whatever that is that you're aligned with, I think is up to the individual. And
yes,
and I did make a video about how you could be like an atheist, a spiritual atheist, and it went down like a sack of shit with the atheist community. They were like, oh, spirituality is bullshit. I'm like, no, it's everyone can be spiritual. We don't want to be spiritual. Fuck you. So,
yeah.
So it's that baggage that you were talking about. It's maybe it's just too loaded a word.
Some people do, they do kind of lump it with religion. It gets lumped with religion a lot, and it's really like nothing to do with religion. I mean, obviously there's overlap, particularly the Eastern religions, because they're more experiential than the kind of Abrahamic religions, or the mainstream sects of that. So they do meditate and do dream work and yoga and all this stuff, and kind of go inside. But like a lot of I have a friend who was a Jehovah's Witness, and luckily managed to kind of get himself out of it. And he said it was like totally devoid of any spirituality whatsoever, but it was very religious, and and that kind of like mismatch. So like people kind of tend to lump them together when I think naturally they don't actually go together.
I don't think so. No, it's certainly not my experience.
Not in the West.
Yeah, having grown up in like sort of like Church of England, and none of that resonated me. I don't know if you had a similar school experience to me, but it's sort of like singing hymns and stuff like that in an assembly in the morning. There was nothing really that connecting me to that spiritual side, and that came to the point where I thought, this is delusional bullshit. This is it just. But I didn't get it at all. I didn't realize it was a thing until I had one of these kind of psychedelic experiences, and then thought, there is no real other way to describe what has just happened to me other than kind of spiritual. It's kind of I compared it to like having your first orgasm. It's like, now I know.
Yeah.
Now I get it. But and I think that's something that we kind of have to find a mechanism for putting that back into the culture. And I think this comes to the early point, our early discussion point around, does this necessarily fit well with the clinical sort of setting? Because I think there is something. Well, I mean, kind of 2 points there I'd like to get your input on. One is that that kind of clinical setting, because it is kind of touted as a kind of like a cure for sickness, it doesn't really integrate the experience into like I say, an everyday life kind of setting. And then the other one, I've actually forgotten my first one. Let's just go with that one, because otherwise I'll say too much.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's a valid point, and we need to be a bit wary of because obviously they're going to want, when these things do become medically integrated, particularly if it's a for-profit model, like people are going to want to cut, sort of make savings basically, like in terms of administering these things. And I'm wary about a kind of revolving door approach where people go in and get dosed, and then there's a bit of supportive stuff, and then they just come out. I mean, some people even talk about doing it through an automated computer-based thing. You just get rid of the human therapy component completely, and it really seems to be, or at least from people I know that are kind of working in the field and the therapeutic side of things, that there needs to be, I think there's like the follow-up integration side of things when people come back for these experiences. Because if you think, if you're like, one of the things that's emerged from the research, like beyond just nature connectedness, is a general broad sense of connectedness, to self, to others, to nature, and which is great. And we know there's a good body of research to show that, as well as nature connectedness being very much linked to happiness and well-being, things like social connectedness are powerfully inversely related to things like depression as well. So if you get this boost of connectedness, and that's great, but then you say, if you've got major depression, you've just had this kind of blossoming of connectedness, and you've seen this vista of like, oh wow, this could be like I could live in a new way, and and not be burdened by sort of what I was before. But then you kind of go out back into society, which is, as mentioned, like fundamentally disconnected essentially. I think over time although it seems from the research that the nature connectedness shift do seem to be sustained actually, but other forms of connectedness, they do seem to kind of start to recede after a few months. And that kind of makes sense, because it's kind of like they're going to just sort of adjust to the societal baseline after a while, I think. So unless you're actively doing something to sort of augment, sustain, build on that connectedness, and that, you know, that could be potentially like many different things. I wrote a paper trying to make a case for group-based nature restoration activities. So we know nature's really good for your health, but what about actually doing some community wildlife gardening stuff, beach and river cleanups, tree planting, habitat creation, all that stuff, but in groups. So just to kind of like, so there's a social element to it. So perhaps the people that are a bit less enthused about nature, they get sort of the social buzz of it. It seems that social connectedness, nature connectedness correlate and synergize with each other. It seems that connectedness as a whole is kind of like this broad interconnected spectrum. And psychedelics seem to kind of increase it across that wide frontier. But it's like, how do we kind of hold on to that? And how do we bolster and build on that? Otherwise, you might sort of like come back down. Like, sure, you might have had some useful insights that might help you, and hopefully, you found some way to kind of act on them. But we need to, I think, be giving more thought about the kind of the follow-up integration, the aftercare side of things. And this is why, so my good friend, Dr. Ros Watts, she was the clinical lead of a psilocybin major depression study, Imperial phase 2 study. And then she went off and was clinical director of the Synthesis Institute in the Netherlands. But now she's kind of left academia. She's left those sort of situations because she wants to do it her way. She doesn't want to be kind of necessarily towing the line to sort of what different departments or organizations want to do, because she really feels that people after these experiences aren't getting anywhere near enough support. And so, like when she was part of the Imperial study, she set up a kind of like a monthly kind of meetup in London, where everyone who was on the study could all meet up and they could chat about their process stuff that was coming up or stuff that was going on in their lives. And she's now set up her own thing called ASA Integration, and that's a kind of like nature orientated, you kind of like, it's aligned with the Celtic tree calendar, but also like group kind of based as well. I think a year-long integration program, so people have more support. So there are people kind of thinking about this, and apart from her as well, there are others like thinking like more about the long game and not just the experience itself.
I wonder if that's what kind of correlates what you're saying earlier about the kind of the 4 ayahuasca ceremonies within a month period versus 20, because then, because you're in this kind of you're basically in a kind of integration 24/7 integration scenario there. So if you're spending like a month at some sort of traditional retreat, but you've only drank, say, ayahuasca 4 times, but then that experience is with you, and you're just in you've not got any of those kind of stresses of ordinary life going on. So that kind of integration's kind of happening, and kind of interestingly, they don't really even count it as that in the Amazon. They don't really have a, hey guys, let's sit around and integrate. Let's have an integration workshop, because it's just so baked in to the thing that they don't really have a separate thing for it. It's just like, there's absolutely zero problem with talking about the experience you had meeting, accessing the Akashic records or whatever over breakfast. Whereas if I did that in England or in Switzerland where I lived, then I'd be probably dragged off to the loony bin quite quickly. So I think there's something there where we need to weave it into the kind of like the fabric somehow of society. And I've been kind of pondering on this question myself, like just what could this look like? Because I mean, we talked a little bit about like religion earlier, but and again, there's a loaded word there, with religion. But I think we've got to acknowledge what kind of religion does well in terms of kind of being able to integrate what it is, because it's completely integrated into, certainly in the US or in the UK and stuff. And I think if we're talking about trying to access those same again, I don't think it is the same, but let's just say it is, you know, the same kind of spiritual states, or this, you know, these kind of bigger than me questions. And so, yeah, I don't know, have you got any thoughts on how we can get that into the culture without it? I don't know. I mean, does it need to become some sort of like religion or some kind of community-based structure that, you know, again, this is something that's baked into it in the Amazon, because you are sitting in your community drinking the ayahuasca in the first place anyway, and you've got these shamans are serving the community, so it's just so already there. And how do we pick that up and plop it into the Western world? Do we try and like replicate that model, or do we try and come up with something new? And just blue sky thinking, what's your thoughts here?
Yeah. So I mean, I think to some degree these things will be used by certain religious sects. I mean, you know, we're seeing the Santa Dame and the UDV are sort of with ayahuasca are kind of like pretty widespread over much of the world. Well, good chunk of it, both sides of the Atlantic, and yeah, well, that's something interesting, weird I saw very recently about this. I don't know if it's called, I don't know if you've heard of it, psilomethoxin, and the claim is that Shulgin wrote about that if you feed synthetic tryptamines to psilocybe cubensis fungi, they will just make new compounds.
Okay.
And they're claiming that they fed 5-MeO DMT to this fungus mycelium, and it's made a new kind of hybrid of 5-MeO and psilocybin. Like, I don't know, like, what the dealio is there, but they're calling it, I think it's like the Church of Psilomethoxin. There's like the Church of the True Inner Light. I think that was a DPT church in New York, and then there's the Church of the Toad as well. You know, there's a few little like things going on, but I think ultimately, and this may be, you know, a little way off, perhaps not so much in some parts of the states like Oregon, Colorado, that are kind of taking the necessary steps, but I think seeing psychedelics kind of being used in a more community based context in the future, like maybe with like, you know, there'll be like centers, there'll be safe places where people can go potentially, you know, if people do want to like be supported or have other people kind of, you know, so that would be the, you know, because psychedelics intrinsically appear, they can act as catalysts of connection, I've called them, like, but that ability that they have is very much dependent on the context and the way in which they're used, you know, and seeing them like potentially being used in a more community-based and more nature-based and also group-based ways, I think we could kind of really maximize on that aspect of them, for our betterment. So looking ahead a bit, I think it would be great to see some kind of like community-based models, you know, rather than, otherwise, you know, these things will be in the medical tool bag, you know, which is great, and it will help a lot of people, hopefully, like, but it's sort of, you know, there's much more potential to psychedelics than medical treatments or therapy aids.
Yeah.
And it would be a shame for them to sort of only be allowed to exist in that particular mold. I think one which I've had my eye on, one kind of model is, I don't know if you've seen what the artist Alex Gray does with his kind of Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, where he has this kind of center where it's very kind of, you know, it's based around sort of community art, you know, the people go and do these amazing pieces of psychedelic art, but then they have these kind of like, I think it's like full moon ceremonies where I'm guessing they're up to some psychedelic shenanigans. But so it kind of gives there's a place of focus for the kind of the group, and you know you've got a kind of like a localized chapter of this kind of, you know, of this group, which are having regular events. And I thought that might be a way to go, because, you know, it's these kind of communities coming together, and the kind of one of the models that sprang to mind was like maybe something around like, you know, similar to like you have with like biker gangs or Hells Angels or something like that, where you have like localized chapters but part of a bigger collective, all following a similar kind of playbook, and then which also then gives a possibility for kind of these chapters coming together in some sort of like mega event, you know, like where they have these big bike rallies, you know,
And that would,
Yeah.
I think one version of that mega event, I think, would be something like Burning Man or something like that, you know. So you have these, like, localized, smaller things, but a kind of maybe like a group mission statement, a group project, or something like that.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think that's obviously a lot of the stuff I said there is kind of fairly like US centric, and I can see it working there because they have this kind of quite strong, like rebellious subculture. Whereas when I think of it somewhere in the UK, I don't know if it quite fits as well. But I don't know. Maybe I'm a bit skeptical there. I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking now. I know, so the Psychedelic Society, which I think kind of sprang up in London, I think they've kind of like expanded, and I think there is kind of like Psychedelic Society group meetups and events and stuff happening in like places like Bristol, also now Edinburgh, and I'm sure there's other cities as well where there's kind of like an increasingly, there's a growing kind of extended mycelial network of peeps, but I don't know to what degree, you know, it's like they all come together and stuff like that, but I know there are little growing hubs where people interested in this kind of stuff can meet up and like with fellow like-minded people and stuff like that. And I'll say as well, I'll give a shout out for Breaking Convention. I don't know, have you been?
I've not been. I saw that. I mean, obviously, it's not been happening, has it, for the last couple of years? Because
no, it hasn't.
Yeah,
because of COVID and other stuff has kind of scuppered it. But that's because, you know, I've just got the Swiss conference in mind. I feel like I've been very spoiled by Breaking Convention, because it feels kind of more like a festival or it has felt more like a festival than a conference. You know, academic conferences can be pretty dry, and Breaking Convention isn't like that. It's such, you know, there's such a wide spectrum of people there because psychedelics, you know, they kind of intersect with so many different fields and so many different interests. You know, you've got all your science, your neuroscientists and your psychotherapists, your psychiatrists, your psychologists, but you've also got your kind of like your more creative people. You've got your artists and you've got your musicians, you've got your writers, you've got your poet. You know, you like all this whole, it kind of intersects of all these different areas. So you just get this melting pot of like weird, interesting people. And it seems like from that actually that there is definitely a bit of like a community vibe that's kind of grown up around that, even though the conference only kind of happens, or would if it wasn't for COVID, every 2 years. It's kind of established itself now as a charity, and yeah, like some of the people that are kind of part of that, but also the wider network seem to be sort of have a bit of a kind of like, I guess, kind of network hub, and you know, they meet up and hang out and do stuff. So there is some stuff going on, I guess.
I mean, I saw Breaking Convention was happening. It is happening in 2023, is it? So I put it in my calendar, and
I highly recommend it. It's actually been quite formative. Like I don't know if I would be doing psychedelic research work if it wasn't for that conference. And I know other people actually that got in, that was their on-ramp to doing psychedelic therapy, and I've just like met lots of good people. David Luke is one of the people behind it, and he's become a good friend, sort of mentor, and you know, like, so yeah, I it's got a special place in my heart actually.
Yeah, I mean, I put it in my calendar. As soon as I became aware of it, I was like, oh, wow, this seems like the one to go to. And then it's like COVID happened. Everything was just annihilated. Like, God damn it. But yeah, I think I'd love to go. Are you aware of this other thing that happened fairly recently? I think it was called like the Tyringham Initiative or something like that. Yeah. Were you there?
Yeah.
Or?
No, I wasn't. Like, no, I know quite a few people that were, or the kind of, some people I was kind of like, you definitely should be there, because I think it was a DMT meetup event. Other people, it's like, what's your expertise in DMT? How did you get to go? But you know, that's a side tangent. But no, I know some of those guys though that are sort of like all interested in studying, researching DMT, but from slightly different angles.
Yeah, I thought that would seem like an interesting meetup, because it was this very selected group of I would like not just academics. There were some fairly like new agey type people there, but apparently it was a very productive meeting, and I thought that was a really good initiative. And yeah, I don't know a few of the guys who were there, and they spoke really highly of it. But yeah, I'll definitely put a breaking convention in, because it seemed like, I think, like I say, it did seem to have this more of a festival-y vibe. And is that because it's like, is it having more kind of like breakout stuff going on rather than just a sort of...
Yeah, I mean, so it does. So that, yeah, there is. I mean, there's like, you know, there's like three different rooms of talks going on. So you can pick and mix different talks, but there's also like workshops and other random kind of like activities happening in different parts of the place throughout the day as well. So you can kind of pick and mix. I mean, to be honest, when I've been there, I mean, it was at the University of Greenwich, and it was right by the Thames. It's a really nice spot, and like when the sun's out, like there's like these nice grass lawns just outside. And if it's like really hot, I mean, my talk attendance has I guess dropped off over the years to not very much, because I'm just like hanging outside, just chatting to people and catching up with people and stuff. And I think that's one of my favourite bits of it. And then also there is the after parties as well, and they're also fun. So yeah, I think now for the first time it's kind of outgrown Greenwich Uni. I think it felt last time to me that it was bursting at the seams in terms of like, because the popularity's grown, and it was like some of the popular talks you couldn't even get in there like anywhere near. There was like queues going back. So it feels like it needs to kind of like it needs a new place, like a hermit crab moving up to a larger shell. And I think Exeter Uni is going to be the place. And they're going to do it earlier this year because they've had problems, I think, with kind of overlapping with festival season. So they've cunningly thought, okay, no, we'll do it kind of like end of April time instead.
Excellent. Well, hopefully I might see you there next year. And I think April time.
Cool.
One of the other sort of papers that I sort of read yours was this talking about psychedelics as a kind of a way of I think the term you actually used as a catalyst for creativity, and I just wonder what to sort of like pick your brains on that a bit. Could you I don't put in like a couple of lines like the premise of that paper?
Yeah, sure. I wrote that paper because I was interested. There was a really interesting study done right at the tail end of the first wave of psychedelic research, and in fact it was ongoing when one of the investigators, Jim Fadiman, who's become associated with psychedelic microdosing, he was running the study with his investigators, and he got this letter from the Food and Drug Administration or the DEA, one of those organisations, like saying there's been a total ban on all research everywhere starting now. And it literally just dosed the scientist there, I think, with mescaline or something. So it was like, I'm going to put this in the drawer and forget about it until tomorrow. And so he did. And it was like, oh God, I had to sort of stop right as it was happening, this interesting kind of rolling study where scientists, engineers, essentially scientific creatives who were creative problem solving, were administered what we would consider by the clinical dose standards a kind of like medium dose, like a smaller dose, because you don't want to incapacitate people. High doses of psychedelic can affect cognitive ability and processes, and you're more likely to be involved and wrapped up in your own personal emotional stuff. So this is a case of you want to be a bit more functional. So you don't want to go all in dose wise. You want a bit of a less dose. And it was, this study really caught my interest because the fact that it was using real professional scientific creatives, be they engineers, architects, scientists working more on theory, there was a whole range of different creatives selected, and they were working on genuine creative problems or tasks that they'd been working on for some time and they were grappling with but unable to move forward. And the kind of the results that this study produced, bearing in mind it was a smallish pilot study and it wasn't controlled and blah blah blah, but it was still like, oh wow, this is interesting, this is compelling, I want to kind of unpack this a bit more. And then I kind of delved into some of the literature looking at how other, some scientists there's been some huge breakthroughs and insights that have been catalyzed by dreams. and hypnagogic states as well. You know, that liminal between waking and sleeping dream state that you can draw out and sort of play with more if you choose to. And I was kind of aware that, you know, the research that's been done on what's going on in the brain with psychedelics such as psilocybin, like there's a lot of shared phenomenological and also neurobiological overlap shared by the psychedelic state and the dream state.
Yep.
So I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. If those scientists are have had those big insights or breakthroughs catalyzed by dreams and hypnagogic states, it seems that the psychedelic state is pretty similar, but kind of more dependable. You get like, it's like an on-tap altered state experience. It's like dreams are like, you know, when you're in a dream, you tend to be, unless you're lucid dreaming, you're kind of completely wrapped up in the narrative of the dream, and you're kind of unaware that you're dreaming. You can't really, it's not so easy to carry intent into that experience as well. And there's not really the metacognition that's going on when you're in a psychedelic state or the hypnagogic state, where you're aware that you're altered, and you're sort of aware enough to be able to kind of like, you're not kind of fully drifting away with the fairies. I mean, with the hypnagogic state, you're always on a knife edge of like, you know, falling into sleep. But with psychedelics, you get this longer time window. And not just that, I think it brings other things that perhaps the other states don't do so much. So one of these is the global connectivity of the brain increases, you know, so different regions and departments of the brain are all linking up and talking to each other more. And there's been separate research on highly creative people, and it seems that capacity for the brain to kind of different parts of the brain to kind of all link up seems to be tied to creativity. And another thing that psychedelics do is they can induce this what's being called relaxation of priors. So prior beliefs, expectations. So, you know, to sort of save energy, your brain, when you're interfacing with the world, it's kind of projecting out what it thinks is there based on prior experience and the expectations that are built on those prior experiences. So, you know, but when you're on a high dose of a psychedelic, that kind of filtering, data censoring, editing capacity of the brain kind of goes offline, and you can kind of almost subjectively see it, because sometimes if you're tripping, you can be looking at something, and I describe it a bit like it's like you're an alien that's just plonked down on Earth, and it's like you're kind of looking at things for the first time ever, and there's none of that prior conditioning or anything there. It's gone. And that, I think, is relevant to creativity as well, because, you know, creativity essentially boils down to the creation of effective or useful novelty, something new that's useful. And sort of inferring from that, it kind of hints that the novelty aspect anyway, you're not going to come up with something kind of created by treading already well-trodden pathways in your mind. And looking at things, problems or whatever it might be, with that prior conditioning or the prior expectations, that can actually potentially get in the way of creative thinking. So I think it's quite interesting that psychedelics can kind of wipe the slate clean a bit there and allow you to look at things through new eyes, in a sense. And then it gets, you know, there's different levels to it as well. So something that you see in a shamanic context in Central South America, among shamans there. So it's that a difference between the scientific approach to knowledge and the shamanic approach to knowledge. You know, the scientific approach, it's about being detached and objective and running experiments and making observations, changing variables, seeing what effect it has. But you try and disentangle or dissociate yourself most of the time from being involved in that process. Whereas the shamanic approach is very different in that, like, if you want to learn about something, you kind of embody and become that which you want to know more about. And something that crops up in the shamanic context, but also in cases of scientists using psychedelics as creativity enhancing tools, is that they will become that which they are studying. So an interesting case in point, particularly interesting, is it in that it didn't happen under the psychedelic; it actually happened afterwards. So shifting that there was some change in cognition or ability to visualize afterwards. So, and this was Carrie Mullis, who came up with the PCR, the polymerase chain reaction, a way of kind of amplifying, magnifying DNA, which was like a fundamental to the science of genetics, like a huge leap forward. And he was kind of like, he knew that he was onto something, but he couldn't quite kind of like line up. And then he said, he had dabbled with LSD, and then following that, he was kind of in a reverie of some kind. And he said he was sitting on a ribosome in a cell, and he was kind of like watching the polymerase enzymes go by. So he had this what felt like a perspective of his particular object of study. So you got this level of detail, and that to him was like, that helped him kind of like come up with his breakthrough invention discovery, which won him the Nobel Prize.
Well, I mean, it's when we kind of think about it, it's not super surprising that happens, because even the stuff we were talking about earlier, the kind of the connectedness, this is stuff where you get this new perspective on something which you at the time it almost like feels completely obvious. It's like, but it's like a new insight into yourself. It's just kind of looking here rather than looking at some sort of engineering problem. But yeah, once you kind of see these things, it's like, oh right, yeah, this is a new perspective on this particular problem. The problem being, I've no idea who I am or what I'm eating or who I'm talking to or what my place in the universe is. So yeah, and if I understand right as well from on the subject of people having those things, it wasn't DNA itself, like the kind of the whole double helix thing. Did that come around by psychedelics?
So unfortunately, I have delved into this, and I did mention it in the paper actually, because I thought if I didn't, someone's going to flag. It's like, why the hell didn't you talk about DNA? So I did weave it in, but as far as I'm aware, from having kind of looked into this, there's not really the evidence to show that Francis Crick used LSD in the set, and that then led to the discovery of DNA. Because I think it was 1953, right. So it was about 10 years after the discovery of LSD. So Hoffman had already made it. 5 years later, he'd remade it, and then he'd had the first trip. And at that time, it was little known outside of very select psychiatric circles. It wasn't really known about very much in the wider kind of like society, wider public. Ronald Sanderson, who was a prominent early LSD psychotherapist, who used it for psycholytic therapy, so lower-ish doses as part of a therapeutic regime. He went to meet Albert Hoffman in 1952, and he brought loads of ampules of LSD back, and that was a pretty early influx of LSD into the UK. It seems a bit, although I think Francis Crick was connected. He did know people, or would come to know people involved with the LSD manufacturing side of things, and he certainly liked it. He was definitely experienced, and he definitely commented on the experience of it. But this wasn't this. Yeah, it's likely his first time wasn't till quite a few years after the DNA discovery. And should also give a shout out to Rosalind Franklin, who gets a bit forgotten from the sometimes a bit underappreciated, who did this amazing work with X-ray crystallography to effectively get a kind of snap of the molecule, and that definitely was a big contribution to that discovery. Yeah,
I mean, just on that topic of sort of psychedelics kind of inducing sort of or activating creativity, it's certainly, I mean, I could certainly attest to that experience myself, and I was kind of. It's one of those things where I've experienced it while I was doing some kind of research stuff for my channel, because I was doing some a video on making some on some methods of vaping DMT, and so I was doing lots of little bits of DMT, and I would just have these creativity explode, like angles of like storytelling and ideas that I would never have dreamed of, and they just would come just like often like multiple of them. and then I'd just be like, yeah, it was kind of shocking how much it kind of stimulated that. And then again, I could almost think of like that turning into some sort of dystopia of, you can almost imagine like some sort of Google-esque, call center where it's like, okay, employees, take a chug on your creative thing and get programming, and so there's all these kind of things where it's like, oh god, it goes so wrong, but there's so much potential for goodness in these things. What's your? I think, are you hopeful, or are you kind of like cautious a bit of where we're at the moment? Are you seeing a bright future, or is there some sort of causes for concern there? Or are you somewhere in the middle?
You know what? So part of me is growing, possibly, unfortunately, increasingly cynical with, I think, how things are shaping up. Like some of the kind of actors in the field, some of the kind of the corporatization aspects. I do have some kind of slight concerns with how things are kind of shaping up, but not saying without hope. I know there are some fantastic people and also organizations kind of active in the space that are doing good stuff. What's kind of where is my head at these days? But as for psychedelics themselves, did kind of decoupling them from the wider society, corporate money making interests and all that, I do feel have a lot of potential, and we've really only just scratched the surface. I know there's loads of research going on, but it's all basically fairly preliminary stages. So we also need to kind of like check our enthusiasm in some respects. But I'm like, and I've tried to kind of, I guess, make the case in my work that there is more to these things than just their potential as medicines and therapy amplifiers, which is great, and I'm all for, and I think that's really important work that I'm glad is happening. But I don't want that to be the only work that is deemed important enough to happen.
I think it's like a similar story to like what's going on with like the internet or something like that. I think I think it's inevitable that with psychedelics it's going to become sort of like capitalized in some way. There's going to become these kind of corporations that really cash in it. The kind of the equivalents of like your Facebook and your Googles of psychedelics. But I think that doesn't necessarily take away from, just because there's Facebook or social media, there's still like online forums and communities. And I think that would be, although I'm sort of cynical towards those whatever mega corporations arise out of this, and I think, like I say, I think that's almost inevitable. As long as there's room for the local community-based chapters, as long as there's still room for that, then I think it'll be okay. Or because that doesn't. It doesn't stop people sort of, joining their biker gang, joining the art community or whatever. But I think I think it's is there a way to get away from the average normal person consumer seeing Facebook as like this is the entirety of the internet? I don't think there is. I think that's just how the mainstream of things work. So I think I'm with you. I'm somewhat cynical, but somewhat hopeful, especially considering we're talking about that, something that's been underground and illegal and still endured. I think it could maybe stand in the face of a few corporations, but I don't know. There's a lot of ways to fuck things up. I don't know.
There is, and I think that's why I guess researchers and stuff are being. People have been cautious in terms of, there's still bad stuff that happens, bad conduct by, a small minority of like dodgy therapists doing up to naughty stuff, and like, it's like, but people are screened before entering these studies, and people with like, mental health diagnoses like schizophrenia, psychosis are like screened out and stuff, and there is a lot of generally speaking, there is care and thought that goes into these things. But as psychedelics become more integrated, like there probably unfortunately is going to be accidents and like occasionally bad things
undoubtedly
happening. And it's like, yeah, we've got to be kind of ready and prepared for that, and like not let it, I guess, yeah, it's sort of, some people, I think some researchers have been kind of worried that, if there was one incident, it could derail the whole thing, potentially. And it's like, but moving ahead, we've got to kind of acknowledge that there will be the occasional, there will be bad as well as good. And as you alluded to in your thing, it's like these things are kind of tools, they're amplifiers, and it's sort of like, again, it's very much down to the context, the people using them, the reasons, the motivations, the intentions, like what's going on. That's sort of like really important at kind of predicting the outcomes.
And I think that what I'd like to see is a way for people to be able to fill that gap of the kind of the care community for those people who are going to sort of be the collateral damage of this kind of psychedelic renaissance. Because at the moment, the barrier to entry is so high that, like when we're talking about, there being a psychedelic renaissance and scaling these kind of like integration care and stuff, but we're talking about people who, like, according to like, at least like the regulations so far are like, you have to be like 6 years of sort of higher education and sort of have special permissions and be in some sort of specially built facility. And that's not going to catch the average person on the way to Fabric on a Friday night. That's, I think there needs to be some kind of awareness of what the doors that we're opening here, and some kind of ability for there to be, like, for want of a better term, like spiritual nurses, and to sort of, to be able to, like kind of like, I guess what kind of happens like Zendo project sort of stuff in like festivals, something like that, but really kind of like an A&E version of that, where it's not just kind of like, tranquilize this person and shut them up, but something where we can coach people through this thing. So
that sounds like an interesting kind of approach. I mean, it's good to see the growth of like Zendo and the PsyCare kind of side of things at festivals and big events and stuff, but you're right. And I guess that will, these things probably will come as these things become ever more like integrated and stuff. I mean, I guess it will be interesting to see what pans out in Colorado and Oregon with how they do things moving forward.
Yep, don't fuck it up, Colorado and Oregon. We're counting on you guys. Anyway, Sam, I've been very generous with your time. It's coming up to 90 minutes. So I think it's a good place to wrap it up. Just before we go, is there anywhere you want to like point people to where they can find more about your work and sort of follow you on various social media and stuff?
I mean, I'm kind of I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Samwise Gandy. And if you type in Sam Gandy ResearchGate, my research works are on there. They're pretty much all open access and freely accessible. So if peeps want to have a delve, they're very welcome to. Obviously, there's loads of talks and stuff of me on YouTube and stuff, yabbering away often about nature connectedness, psychedelic stuff. So and feel free to drop me a line on like Twitter or Insta.
Awesome. So I'll put some links in the description text below to Sam's research papers and also to his social media. So Sam, thank you so much for taking the time to me. Like I say, it was so good to hear you talk at ALPS. Thank you as well for coming all the way to Switzerland to deliver that. It was great to hear some familiar accents amongst the Swiss crowd. They don't get my when I'm hanging out with these Swiss people, I try and throw in like a few little humorous quips, and they don't get out of the language barrier. They all think I'm Scottish anyway, and it's like that.
Definitely. There's a different cultural stuff going on there, but no, it was I mean, they were good actually.
It was really good.
Pay for travel and pay for accommodation and stuff, which was nice, because sometimes you're expected, like ICPR in the Netherlands. I got a place to speak, but they were still expecting me to pay 300 euros for the privilege of being there. I was like, I'm an independent researcher. No one's like funding me but me. So I'm like, no, that's not happening. You could really do a bit more of a rolling out the red carpet, not like expecting me to pay for the freaking carpet.
Yeah, that's a bit rich. Yeah, come and speak. At least give you maybe pay for your own travel, but here's the ticket, and a discount voucher for a hotel.
Halfway a bit.
We'll give you a coupon for a free drink.
Yeah, something. There wasn't any attempt to meet halfway. So I was like, no, I'm not game for that. But yeah. What was I going to say? Oh, just a quick little final maybe thought to finish on. Something you were saying before about, spirituality and sort of like, feeling kind of misaligned or disconnected from the self, and just harking back to talking about like what's going on when you're being connected to nature, taking psilocybin in kind of like a cozy concrete box type situation. And I think this is it's an interesting kind of area, but I'm wondering if part of what's going on is you're connecting with your internal nature, because we are obviously chunks of nature. We can't get away from it. We take that with us wherever we go. And I feel like, when you have a high dose of a psychedelic, you're going into your brain, and your brain's all kind of like got mad fractal design of all your neurons. There's fractals all the way down, sort of fractals all the way up, sort of generalizing slightly, but you get me on all different scales. And it's like, I feel like that might be part of what's going on. It sort of doesn't matter where you launch from, because you're gonna go inwards, and you can connect with nature outwards. You can connect with nature inwards. It doesn't actually matter.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think it's a really like I said, it's one of those obvious thoughts, but like you say, we are nature. I sort of very much align with the kind of a lot of the Alan Watts stuff of this. We are. You are nature, you are the universe. And I think a lot of us tend to think of like, oh, you are nature. Well, I am a pot plant. Is that what you're saying? It's like, no. We're all of it. And you are yourself. You are your ancestors. You are your future. You are your place in the cosmos. And that's what makes it so meaningful and makes it such a, you can really feel this sense of alignment within yourself, to the place that you stood, to your place in time, to your place, within your ancestry, your lineage. And it adds so much meaning. So it's not necessarily about like, oh, I am a tree, and stuff, which you are, but it's more than that. And I think that's what this kind of like this spiritual language. It's like, oh right, I am part of this story that is being told, and it goes right the way down, right through your feet, right through the planet, right through the universe, and it's meaningful. And I think that's why it can have such a profound effect on people's lives.
You're part of the story, not just an observer of the story.
Yeah.
I think that's right on.
Beautiful. Well, that was, I think, an excellent sentiment to end on. So again, Sam, thank you so much for your time. I'll do this again sometime.